Русский? Советский.
Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Ushanka Show, stories about life in the Soviet Union. My name is Sergei Sputnikoff and I was born in the USSR. In today's video I'll tell you about Soviet-era cruises to Japan, out of all places, and this story was requested by Tyson, one of my Patreon supporters. And by the way, if you're interested in the topic of Soviet tourism and vacation in the Soviet Union, I already have a separate playlist, Soviet Tourism, and link will be below in the comment section. And before we begin, I would like to mention that despite the fact that I grew up in the USSR and I spent 20 years of my life there between 1971 and 1991, I had no idea that such cruises existed, that people could actually visit Japan during the Soviet days. So it just tells you that those cruises were not advertised and it was not easy to get on one of those. Of course, I was aware that some lucky comrades were able to travel to other countries, mostly socialist countries, and I believe the most popular destination was Bulgaria, because it was located on the shores of the Black Sea, the popular destination for summer vacation. My family never had a chance to travel outside the country, and in all 20 years, there was only one time when my father could purchase a traveling voucher, Putyovka, to the Azov Sea, where we stayed for 10 days at the local house of rest. That's how they call Doma Отдыха. But I think I told you plenty about my family, and in this video let's talk about Oksana, who in May of 1981 went on a cruise around Japan. Oksana was born in 1956, so I guess she was the second wave of the Soviet baby boomers. She grew up in Alma-Ata, the capital of Kazakhstan. What I learned from her stories, both of her parents were doctors, and they lived in a huge 1,000 square feet apartment downtown Alma-Ata. So she was definitely had a different lifestyle comparing to my family. And if she had a YouTube channel, you probably would say, man, this is a different Soviet Union. When Oksana was 10 years old, she went to the most prestigious summer camp in the Soviet Union, although we didn't call them summer camps, we called them pioneer camps. So there was a pioneer camp Artek in Crimea. And when she was 20, just 20 years old, she had a chance to go to Bulgaria. And in 1981, when she was just 25, she went on this cruise around Japan. So when I read Oksana's story about her cruise to Japan, the very first sentence already got my attention because it was quite stunning. She wrote, "I got on a tourist trip to Japan in 1981 by accident." You know, Soviet citizens had to wait and be on a waiting list for several years for their turn to go on a trip like this, or they had to do something outstanding at work to be awarded with a trip like that. And she just got there by accident at the age of 25. And that's because she worked at the main office of Sputnik, which was a Bureau of International Youth Tourism in Alma-Ata. So all these traveling packages, all the putyovkas that were designated for Kazakhstan first arrived at this office, and then it got distributed all over the republic. So she worked at the place that had access to all the different cruises that were available. So of course they had the first dibs. And what she said next is even more interesting. She said, in my department, everyone already went to several different countries that year. But they all had a lot of work experience and great merit, so they had a lot of seniority over her. She was just 25. Normally, we traveled as a group leaders or propaganda people. So since the Soviet tourists were required to travel in groups, every group had to have a leader. So these guys from Sputnik office were providing services as group leaders, so they were traveling for free. Or there would be a propaganda people, literally those propagandists, that's how she wrote. So while on a trip to the west or to Japan, to the east, there should be a guy explaining of benefits of socialism while you're looking at the capitalist abundance. This guy will be like, hey, or a girl, remember, there's a lot of homeless people in Japan or, in France, and there's a lot of unemployment. So despite all these stores, remember there is unemployment and there is a homelessness. So let's see how Oksana managed to get that cruise to Japan. She couldn't go as a group leader, so she was destined to become a tourist herself and pay out of her own pocket. And she said she didn't have enough money, so she knew she could have to borrow and then pay back. So she walked into the Sputnik office and blurted out, "I want to go somewhere." And the guy who was her friend laughed and said, "Of course you do. Where do you want to go?" And she said, I replied, "Anywhere, somewhere exotic." And he replied, "Well, if you can hurry up and get 5 special vaccinations, we can include you on a cruise along the coast of Africa." So there's another, I have no idea that we had cruises available to go along the coast of Africa. And she replied, "No, not so exotic. I would like exotic with combination of high civilization." And I said, "Well, there's a cruise to Japan." And that's how she ended up getting that cruise in May of 1981. And in May of 1981, she arrived to Vladivostok. It's the port in the far east of Soviet Union, and together with 10 groups from all over the Soviet Union, so about 300 people total, they sailed to the shores of Japan on a cruise ship called Felix Dzerzhinsky. And here's the picture of Oksana sitting next to that ship. It looks like this cruise took about 10 days, leaving Vladivostok overnight, 2-day overnight trip to Otaru, then Tokyo, then Osaka, then visiting Nagasaki, and returning back to Vladivostok. And I think now it's a good time to discuss the cost of such a cruise. So 10-day cruise around Japan, cost was about 800 rubles per person, or if you choose a Lux level cabin, it's about 1,000 rubles. And considering the fact that average salary in the Soviet Union at that time was around 150 rubles per month, imagine if you have a $5,000 a month salary, you'll pay $26,000 for 10-day cruise. So extremely expensive. To be fair, members of the labor unions in the Soviet Union could get a 50% discount, so labor union will help you to pay for your trip. So still paying $13,000 for 10-day cruise, it's expensive even with the labor union 50% discount. And as I mentioned earlier, cruise ships departed from Vladivostok. That's the port at the far end of the Soviet Union. So traveling to Vladivostok would add another 300 rubles round trip by plane, or maybe 150 rubles by train. So really expensive adventure. And now let's talk about Oksana's cruise ship. As I mentioned earlier, it was called Felix Dzerzhinsky. And it just, now I'm like wondering, what the hell? Why would you name a cruise ship after the guy who was in charge of ЧК? So it's All Russian Extraordinary Commission. That was the first Soviet secret police organization. Just imagine you are boarding the cruise, and instead of beautiful name Pacific Princess or something like that, your ship is called J. Edgar Hoover.
Чего не смеетесь-то? Не смешно? Не поняли, да? Это Россия.
But the ship, despite its depressing name, had a quite interesting history. It was built in German Democratic Republic in 1958. It was called Project 301, so it's the amount of passengers it could fit. It was 122 meters long. It had a restaurant, bars, music saloon, barber shop, and even a small movie theater. SS Felix Dzerzhinsky spent about 10 years in Odessa, Ukraine, in the Black Sea, and doing cruises, I guess, around Mediterranean. Then in 1970, he was transferred to the Far East, and then he did cruises from Nakhodka and Vladivostok. Her most famous passenger was most likely David Bowie, who in spring of 1973 traveled on Felix Dzerzhinsky from Japan to the Soviet Union, and then he took a train from Vladivostok to Moscow. And there's a really cool book for sale on eBay, but unfortunately I can't afford it. It's a lot of money. There were a total of 3 Soviet cruise ships that traveled around Japan. Another one was called SS Vladivostok, later renamed into SS Priamurye. It was also built in German Democratic Republic in 1960. Same model, Project 301. The type was called Mikhail Kalinin. That ship had a sad history. On May 18, 1988, it caught fire in Osaka, Japan, and a total of 11 people died. And soon after, that ship was towed back to the Soviet Union and scrapped. And the third cruise ship was called Konstantin Chernenko, so that was named after a deceased Soviet leader. It was built in Poland in 1986, and actually that wasn't a cruise ship, it was more like a car passenger ferry. It could transport 150 cars and 400 passengers, and it featured a swimming pool on the main deck. That ship lasted the longest, of course, because it was the newest. First, it was renamed into Rus, Russia in 1988. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was busy moving people who were buying stuff in Japan and bringing back, especially cars. So it lasted for a long time. Then it was sold to China. But let's go back to Oksana and her cruise in May of 1981. Another interesting detail, she mentioned that not everyone owned a camera. So she borrowed a Zenit film camera from one of her friends who was a photographer. So that's the only reason why she had several photos, and all of them were black and white. Now, thanks to modern technology, I could make them look nice and in color. Oksana shared an interesting story about visiting Tokyo. She said, "We were allowed several hours of independence in Tokyo. As I mentioned earlier, Soviet tourists were required to travel only in groups with the leader and a supervisor from KGB quite often. In this case, they told them, like, you can be on your own. Still, they gathered a small group of 6 people and decided to visit Ginza, the famous shopping district. And the next thing she said is so Soviet. We weren't going to buy anything there, just take a walk and explore. So they go into the famous shopping district, but not planning to buy anything. And you know why? Because Soviet tourists were allowed to exchange only 30 rubles worth of foreign currency. 30 rubles, even in 1981, was just enough to buy some silly souvenirs. So they just were going to walk and take a look. Oksana experience traveling by subway in Tokyo reminded me of my own experience of traveling by subway in New York City in 1995. I was also similarly disappointed. Just, nothing fancy, no fancy entrance, no escalators, just a little bit of steps going down. And that's what she said. Yeah, we had to take metro, subway, and we couldn't find it because that was just a basic door, nothing like, entrance in the Soviet Union. And she said, yeah, we just walking a step down, no escalators. Walls were having yellow tiles, similar to tiles from Czechoslovakia that we use for our bathrooms. We were so disappointed. After all, this is an extraordinary country with such a high level of technological development, already in those years unattainable for any country in the world. And then the subway like that, really basic, a little primitive. And Oksana continues, we found ourselves on a famous street finally. I don't know what day of the week it was, but the street was practically deserted. There are tall buildings on both sides of the street, and we entered one of them. There were 3 floors down and 4 floors up, something like a current hypermarket, but it was all new to us. Let me remind you, it was the year 1981, but I have already quite a few trips around the Soviet Union and one to Bulgaria. Still, I was shocked. We walked around the stores in silence, just whispering to each other. Our eyes were round and shocked. Everything inside froze from seeing the prices. We couldn't afford anything. Then Oksana describes her experience walking into the bathroom design store. She said, I was froze and I was stunned. I saw these terry towels in all the sizes, rugs of different shapes, slippers and plastic accessories, and all exactly matching colors. And not just white, black, or red. The colors were crazy. Selection was insane, including juicy purple color. All the rest of the colors that I already forgot what they look like, but they said the image still stands in my eyes. Then Oksana describes her experience walking in another store which was selling leather products. She said, genuine leather, gloves, belts, purses, handbags and bags, trunks and suitcases, and again displayed by matching color. And I don't just say it was black and beige. There was all kind of shades, including burgundy, and everything was displayed by color and shade. That even made an effect on the guys in my group who visited a lot of stores in Europe. Still, they were shocked. And we didn't notice any buyers, maybe because it was 11 o'clock in the morning, and sellers did not react to us anyway. They understood that we were not buyers. Another interesting story, she was talking about Peace Bell on the grounds of Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. It was interesting that she mentioned that before going to Hiroshima, we were warned that in Japan, May is the month of struggle for the Northern Territories, which is a Sakhalin Island and northern Kuril Islands. So someone on the ship, I might assume KGB supervisor, warned there could be provocations and there's a chance people be throwing stones at you. But she said, fortunately, everything was fine. But on that day, she writes, I realized there could be a hatred of people could hate the entire multinational country. It doesn't matter about specific people or events. The Japanese just hated us, the entire country. Then Oksana shared this kind of funny story about buying a boombox. So she said everyone wanted to purchase a boombox from Japan that had a dual cassette player that you can copy the cassettes. That was like ultimate dream for any Soviet citizen to own the Japanese boombox. And she said our translator told us that the best deal you can get in the small town of Shimizu on the island of Hokkaido. So we did just that. So they went to the store. Everyone purchased the boombox, but then turned out they needed special adapters for probably because of the electricity. It's 220 volts in the Soviet Union. Japan maybe had just like United States 110. I'm not sure. So they went to another store to buy some cables, and the girl started giving them nice looking like matchboxes. And she thought that instead of change, she gives them matchboxes. So they were like arguing, but it turned out to be that was just a promotional. So they got a lot of cool looking Japanese boxes of matches, and that was like the best souvenir she could give around when she came back to Alma-Ata because it was for free. Otherwise, yeah, she spent most of her money pretty much on a couple of souvenirs and Japanese boombox. And Oksana mentioned that even in 2023, she still had one of those Japanese boxes of matches laying in her drawer, and it brings memories about that trip. So that was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. One in a lifetime she went to Japan. So this is pretty much for Soviet people. That would be one time you'll go on a cruise or some other trip abroad, and then you'll keep memories for the rest of your life. And speaking of Japanese boomboxes, in this photo you see Oksana. She's on the right holding a bag advertising Canyon brand stereos, and probably this is the boombox that she purchased. Oksana also mentioned that they visited Mazda car factory somewhere in Japan, but unfortunately she didn't provide any story or any pictures. That would be cool to learn. Okay, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this story about 1981 cruise around Japan, and I would like to thank again Tyson for suggesting this topic and for supporting my work on Patreon. Thank you so much for watching Ushanka Show. We'll talk to you soon. До побачення. Goodbye.
Enjoying the content? Support the author by picking up a copy of their book.